President Zhang, Chairman Victor Fung, Director Hei Tang, and colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm kind of regular here, so I'm delighted to be back at the Asia Global Dialogue. I think it's my favorite activity during the year. And last night I was very touched because we had a little birthday party for me at a dinner. Not all of you were there, but it was pretty special. So I thought about it overnight, and I've decided to celebrate my birthday every year here. Well, maybe not. After all, you don't turn 80 every year. I asked Hei Tang, by the way, this clock is, I'll keep track of it, it's okay. I asked Hei for 2 hours and he gave me 20 minutes, so here goes. I'm gonna ask you to engage in what I think of as an exercise in pattern recognition, and I'm gonna try to describe what I think the state of the global economy is. Just by way of preliminary, even though this is not captured well in economic theory, there are times when the growth patterns are essentially demand constrained. You want an example of that? Think of the world after the great financial crisis when we had enough balance sheet damage to basically hold back growth, even though the supply side was pretty ample. And there are other times when the supply side is the constraint. The reason it is not built into economic theory is that the demand and supply, we don't have balance sheets. And so this kind of disconnect is not yet appeared. For those of you who are young and doing theoretical research, I highly recommend this as a topic to pursue. And so in that context, I want to argue this morning, and this is going to be pretty brief, that we're in a period of regime change. We are exiting a long period in which essentially demand was the main constraint on growth. And that was the result of a massive injection of productive capacity associated with the growth of emerging economies. That's a period that lasted, well, in Victor's terms, most of the post-war period. That enormous injection of productive capacity produced a deflationary environment and a demand-constrained growth pattern. And that very powerful force is fading. It's not gone, but it's fading. And with it, the elasticity of supply of the global economy is much lower and declining. In addition, there are supply-side headwinds building up against us. This is, I'm now going to give you the bad news before I deliver the good news. The global economy is aging. More than 75% of the global economy comes from economies that are not only aging, they're seriously old. In some cases, the workforce is declining. This does not do wonders for the supply side flexibility. Second, that we have a stunning pattern of declining productivity, especially in the most recent decade. And that's not helping either. Third, we have huge changes in labor market behavior. In addition to the people who are retiring and leaving the labor force but not stopping consuming, we have labor shortages in all the major employment sectors, say in the United States. Literally all: government, healthcare, traditional retail, hospitality, construction. It's over half of the employment in the economy. And then we have, and I guess this is really probably the most significant event that relates to what Victor was just talking about. We are living in an enormously shock-prone system. The Minister of Economy and Tourism in Dubai earlier this week said to me, "I'm getting used to this. We have a crisis every 3 months now. A war, a pandemic, climate shocks that are now macroeconomic events, and so on." And this is giving rise to a process of rebuilding global supply chains with a completely different architecture. What Victor just described was a global supply chain that was built on economics. In my terms, efficiency and comparative advantage. That has been overtaken. He says it's politics, perfectly good description. I say it's overtaken by a pattern of diversification and a focus on security, national security being, the top item. And this is happening in the business sector and in the financial sector but it's being turbocharged by policy now as well, right? And so we're not going to reverse this anytime soon. And that pattern of diversity, let me put it in this bluntest possible form. If you don't set out to minimize costs, you won't. So this pattern of diversification is producing significant increases in the cost. I'm not saying it's the wrong path under the circumstances, but it means that it's a different world. So labor arbitrage is not going to be the driving force, but behind the global economy's architecture on the supply side. Geopolitical tensions are obviously part of this, but the shocks themselves are an important part, particularly the climate shocks. So those headwinds are what I call secular. Now, if we had a little more time, I'd spend some of the time sort of talking about transitory as opposed to secular headwinds. There were some transitory headwinds. The reason this is important is it affected central bank behavior, because they believed most of the problems on the supply side, which are clear, right? And we emerged from the pandemic with a surge in demand everybody knew was coming. It was an even bigger surge because government policy, huge fiscal programs were devoted to preventing excessive balance sheet damage in the household and the corporate sector. Probably the right thing to do. But the supply side couldn't keep up. So the trigger for the inflation that's now running and maybe getting under control is precisely excess demand. And the central banks bet that these things were transitory. Well, there were some transitory ones. Ocean shipping costs were $2,000 across the Pacific per container. They went to $10,000 or $12,000. They're back down to $3,000, not quite where we started. The semiconductor shortages are nowhere near as severe as they were before. China's not in zero COVID anymore, and that's materially important in the global economy. But these other things that I just described to you are there, and they're not going away. So the question is, since these things don't happen overnight, why didn't we see them before? And I think there's an answer to that, and the answer is the great financial crisis. What the great financial crisis did, unlike the pandemic, is produce a massive amount of balance sheet damage in the household sector and to some extent in the corporate sector, mainly because we couldn't figure out a way to stop it. So we saved the financial system at great political cost because it was so unpopular, but we didn't save the purchasing power in the household sector. So we spent a decade in a highly demand-constrained world where these supply-side problems weren't visible. And then we sort of surged out of the pandemic with a very different policy background associated with protecting the household and business sector, and it shows up. And so what does this mean? It means we're living in a world, I'm going to short circuit this a little bit, in which we have had the highest, fastest set of very large interest rate increases in living memory. By the way, the only major economy that doesn't fit this description is China at the moment for idiosyncratic reasons. There's a prolonged period of some imbalances and whatnot. It's still, if you look at a heat map of central bank policy, everybody's raising rates except the Chinese. So what this world, I think, is going to be a world with higher interest rates, even after the inflation fight is done, higher costs of capital, lower debt levels. We can't withstand the debt levels that we have now. The pandemic produced a huge increase in sovereign debt levels. The global number now is over 100% of global GDP. And in a rising interest rate environment, this means declining fiscal space. This is not a pretty picture, especially when you look at the investment levels required to accomplish the energy transition in pursuit of sustainability and so on. So if that was the whole story, then I think I would have contributed to your depression, but it's not. And so the book that they mentioned called Permacrisis that I wrote with Mohammed Al-Arian and Gordon Brown, which was just published, is an attempt to overlay on this something really quite different. And so I'm going to spend a little time telling you what I think that is. Because what I just described is real. I think these are significant headwinds. But overlaid on top of that, we are in the midst of at least 3, I guess 4, major transformations. One of them is the one Victor mentioned, which is the enormous growth of the emerging economies, the shift of the center of gravity of the global economy to Asia. And that certainly won't ever, that's not going to get reversed. The other 3, in my way of thinking about the world, are scientific and technological transformations that are underway. And there are 3 of them. One is a multi-decade digital transformation. The second one is a revolution in biomedical and life sciences. And the third one is the energy transition and the technological underpinnings of that. And the reason these are important is not just because they're kind of interesting achievements. It's because they're driven by enormously powerful tools and technologies whose costs are coming down and are widely accessible. So let me just give you some examples. Solar. Solar costs used to be pretty high. They've come down by a factor of 5 to 10 times in the last decade. You have semiconductors now, thanks to TSMC, at 2 nanometers. You have DNA sequencing. I don't know if any of you looked at the cost of DNA sequencing, but they followed Moore's law for the first decade and then dropped like a stone. So it started at $10 million. It's at $250 now. This is just core technology in biomedical science. And so it goes. I mean, if you read the book, you'll find a fairly long list of these things. But when you add them all up, I think we've been handed a set of weapons to reverse these things. So I'm going to use up the little bit of time I have left talking about what I think the consequences, if we do this effectively, are. First of all, I guess the one that I didn't mention is that there's been just a stunning set of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence in the last 10 years. We had language recognition, translation, image recognition, and now generative AI. I believe the combination of these tools, and I'll end by telling you why I think this, is capable of producing an enormously powerful surge in productivity and in growth. So let me take Gen AI just for the moment. Think of it as large language models or any version of it you want. What are the distinctive characteristics of this? One is it has, for the first time ever, human-like capabilities of shifting domains. What does that mean? That means that you can talk to it about the Italian Renaissance, and it'll talk back. And then you can talk to it about computer coding, and it'll write the first draft of the computer code, etc. You pick any subject. It's trained on the entire internet. Now, there's some problems associated with that, and I'll come to those in a minute. But essentially, this thing, as a platform on which to build specific use cases with tailored data, basically can be done anywhere in the economy. So doctors spend 40% of their time, writing up reports that they're required to produce. The AIs will write the first draft of that. That'll save 80% of that time. There are just so many examples of that. Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford did a study in which an AI was trained, a Gen AI was trained on tens of thousands of hours of customer service, customer interactions in a tech sector, right? And along with performance data, did the customer service person solve the problem? How long did it take to solve the problem? Did they make the customer really angry? The AI can pick that up, etc. And then they gave the digital assistant to a subset of the agents and withheld it from the others and looked at the results. And there were two really interesting results from that, little experiment. This is by a real case study, by the way. There was an immediate 14% increase in productivity, properly measured for the agents. But the most interesting result was that if you think of there being a spectrum of agents, customer service agents in terms of experience, from very experienced to least experienced, everybody experienced an uptick in performance with this digital assistant, but by far the biggest effect was among the least experienced ones. This is what, we don't have a good term for this, but I call this the leveling up effect. It's like going down a learning curve really fast. And so we're going to see, lots of examples of that. And that, if you think about it for a minute, has a kind of inclusiveness dimension to it. Now, we got to be a little careful. Gen AI usually, when you start talking about it in people's minds, means automation. This, I think, is a mistake. So again, Eric Bernolson wrote an influential paper called the Turing Trap. And the Turing Trap runs like this. Alan Turing, the genius who basically brought us the computer, proposed that we evaluate progress in digital technology by asking, can we produce a machine that when it interacts with a human being, the human being thinks he or she is interacting with another human being? And that's essentially in some sense or other, in some general sense, that's the artificial intelligence holy grail. And it's true. Artificial intelligence is benchmarked against human performance, right? In image recognition, in 2016, the machine went past the average human. Now, you might say, well, that's a perfectly reasonable way to kind of think about this. There's one small additional step that's dangerous, and that is, well, when the machine outperforms the human, why don't we replace the human? And that's where you got what I call the automation bias. And it's very real. I mean, if a hospital administrator starts talking about using Gen AI to try to help people in systems work in the hospital, which is, a perfectly well understood application of this, one of several million, people are terrified. They think they're coming for our jobs, right? But that's not the natural use of these things. The natural use of them is as what is sometimes called augmentation or machine-human collaboration. So let me give an example. A lawyer in the United States, when ChatGPT came out, used it to prepare a brief for the court and handed it in. Unfortunately, all the legal precedents in that brief didn't exist. These are called hallucinations in the tech world. In ordinary language, these things make stuff up. Another example, James Manika at Google gave me. We just wrote a paper on productivity and AI together in Foreign Affairs. They had before Bard was released, Bard is Google's ChatGPT, large language model. They asked it to write a paper on inflation, and it did. It was reasonably good, probably get a B+ in an advanced economics course, in macro course. And at the end of the paper, or this article, Bard said, if you're interested in this subject, you might want to read the following 5 articles or books. And then there was a list, and they had plausible sounding titles. None of them existed at all. So these are prediction machines, and they're not perfect. Nobody in their right mind, especially with a few examples like this, is going to use them as anything other than, I think the first draft model is the right one. These are powerful digital assistants, and maybe sometime down the road, they'll be powerful enough to just replace. There's a terminological problem that I'll just mention in passing. If you take the doctor case, and the LLMs are quite capable, I'm sorry, the AIs are quite capable of writing up the report as a first draft. If you define the task as the first draft, that's automation. If you define the task as producing the final report, it's augmentation, right? So there's a certain amount of confusion out there about what this is all about. Bottom line is, and I hope we'll discuss it, you know, this kind of thing later on, is I believe these, you know, whether we're talking about biomedical and life sciences, which won't be measured in productivity or growth data, we're in for a golden age. There are some risks associated with this. They're not the ones that people normally talk about. There is a pattern in digital adoption in previous rounds of great dispersion. So tech sector, very rapid adoption, financial sector, fairly rapid adoption, a whole lot of sectors standing still, right? If we're going to get this productivity surge, it has to be across the entire economy and not display this pattern of diversion and so dispersion. And so there's a role for government in this. You know, JP Morgan is in the process of experimenting with the use of generative AI and a whole lot of other large entities. There's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that don't have the resources to do this. I'm not talking about the resources to train the models. Those things, there's 5 or 10 companies in the world, in the United States and China, that have the cloud computing resources to train these things. And I think we're at the dawn of an era. The bottom line is, you know, we're going to have a tough couple of years, but by the end of the decade, if we do this right, I think we're going to feel a lot better about the inclusiveness and maybe even the sustainability of the growth patterns. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Spence. We're going to set up the stage for our panel discussion. So we'll have our helpful team members out the back. While they're doing that, may I invite our panelists and Professor Haywire to come up onto the stage. Thank you very much. While we're setting up, I'll give a brief overview of who our panelists are. I'm sure Professor Haywire would have lots of reflections and questions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Ontras, Robert G. Ory Professor of Economics at Harvard University, Mr. Fred Hu, founder of Primavera Capital, Ms. Belinda Wong, Chairman and CEO of Starbucks China, and of course, our distinguished Professor Haywire Tang, Director of Asia Global Institute. Over to you, Professor.
Good morning, everyone. It's so happy to see so many of you here today. I felt that it was just yesterday when I had the microphones sitting on the stage talking to you. Time flies, right? Fred, who was here last year, Mike as well. The world has changed a lot since we gathered here last year. Helen already introduced the speakers. We have 1 hour to find solutions. Both Victor and Mike had talked a lot about the world, and I want this stage to be more optimistic. I want to come up with solutions. We have talked a lot about challenges, problems, etc. So I'm not going to repeat all those background. I'm going to jump directly to questions. First, to my PhD advisor from Harvard, Professor Paul Ontras. He's an expert on international trade, global supply chains, and he co-directed a World Development Report published by the World Bank in 2020. So the first question for you, Paul, is what's going on to global trade? What had happened in the last few decades, especially the last 10 years. And we were just chit-chatting before the panel started. And he said, well, hey, why you were very pessimistic? I was like, why? Because I wrote an article around 3 years ago at the very beginning of the COVID, and the title of the article is called Globalization in Crisis. So tell me why you were more optimistic than me, and it seems like we are converging to some sort of balanced, neutral condition. But 3 minutes for you to talk about the world.
3 minutes, okay, great.
You can give 2 minutes to Micah to finish his book talk.
Let me just say, first time, I'm delighted to be here. It's a great event, and I very much appreciate the invitation. So let's go straight. Let's go straight to your question. So I think you're both right that I was more optimistic than you 3 years ago. I think you're right that we're converging. I'm still fairly optimistic. So back in 2020, 21, when we were both writing about deglobalization, I felt it was time to push back a bit. A lot of the talk of deglobalization was not based on data. At that point, the world economy, if anything, was globalizing. The growth of globalization had slowed down. There was not a lot of evidence for deglobalization. And a lot of the factors that people were pushing as potential contributors to deglobalization did not make much sense to me. In particular, there was a lot of talk about automation, and as Mike was saying, automation is probably going to be a good thing for many, many reasons, but it's probably going to be good for international trade. It's not going to replace offshoring. It complements offshoring. So I wrote about that. I wrote about another aspect of technology that I think is very important, was very important at the beginning of the US-China tensions, which is that in the process of laying out global value chains, companies incurred very large investment costs. Some of them were not just financial investments, but were investments in building relationships, which are absolutely key for global value chains. That's essential for the Li and Feng company, the fact that it's reputation and disintermediation is very important. So because these investments were sunk in the presence of high uncertainty in terms of how long those tariffs were going to be in place, a lot of firms played a wait-and-see game, okay, and that was not leading to deglobalization. The one thing that I was worried about, maybe we can talk more about that later, and that I'm arguably increasingly worried about is obviously geopolitics. Not so much the Russia talk, what's going on now in Gaza is just dramatic, but I don't think it's all that important for the future of the world economy. But obviously, US-China relations were a concern and are a concern. I was a bit more optimistic than you, perhaps, because from what I gather, from what I've learned, interacting with people in China, is that China is very much committed to the multilateral world trading system. So I felt like if the US understands this, I think there's a path forward. And here, maybe we'll talk more later, but that's where I'm a bit more worried. I'm not sure that things are moving in the way that I had anticipated.
Okay. So basically, you became less optimistic because of the geopolitical events, especially the wars in Europe and in the Middle East. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to Belinda. So Belinda is the CEO and chairwoman of Starbucks China. Obviously, we all love Starbucks. Every time when I travel to China, when I see Starbucks, I feel comfortable, right? It's my comfort zone. It's like, I need my coffee. I know, how it's going to be taste. But as an American company with 6,000 stores in 230 cities, tell me, how has your business been? And, what are the risks and opportunities in China that you're watching every day for your expansion plan?
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor. I'm a local Hong Konger. It's great to be able to share my stories or our company stories back to the whole Hong Kong community. Starbucks China, my team and I are responsible for our growth in the mainland. So 25 years ago, we started our first store all the way now to 6,800 stores in 800 cities. We're now being very granular into the county level cities, so 800 plus cities. I think what was really interesting was the last 3-4 years when we had to deal with COVID, and then also the rising geopolitical tension, right? So our business is actually, we're quite blessed because we're in the coffee industry. We're not in the technology sector. So we're certainly not immune to
geopolitical tension, but we have decided a long time ago that we're going to focus ourselves on what we can control. Now, in our business, we have each and every store. We don't really just opening stores like a standard. We try to open one store in each community at a time. It is very important that we build relationship with our customers because we're very direct. So it is about they are going to vote. They're going to come in and vote by their feet if they come into our stores or not. So we have to build that relationship. Just like when you go to your coffee shop, you have to feel that you belong there. So that's what we're trying to do. And everything that we're doing, in terms of digitalization and all the investment that we're doing, we're trying to help our people to be able to run their store in a way that they can build relationship with their customers. So a long time ago, we know we cannot control what we cannot control, and we're going to focus on what we can control, which is that human connection and bringing that value to our customers. So with that conviction, we just went on, and on the reverse, we are very, instead of worrying about what's going to happen in the world, people spending and the economy, we have made a decision to invest further 3 years ago, even further. So we expanded our store count by 65% just in the last 5 years. So that's real action on our investment in China. And we built a roasting plant in China that was signed in March 2020, in the beginning of the Wuhan COVID era. So, and we've even got a letter from Premier Li Keqiang recognizing our courage and our commitment to China. And the roasting plant was open just a month ago. 3 years during COVID, we built. And then we also invested over 200 million to build a technology center, innovation and technology center in working with Shenzhen in the Greater Bay Area. We just announced that a couple of months ago. So I'm giving you all that example because we believe China is still a very important market for us. It's one of the world's largest consumer market, as you know. The headroom for growth for us in our sector, in our industry, right now market average is 13 cups a year in China versus in Japan, 300 cups of coffee a year, or United States, 380. So you can imagine the headroom for growth is enormous. So we believe we're committed. We believe in China consumer market, in the coffee industry. We're doubling down our investment, and we're going to move forward. And we're going to challenge ourselves to be very relevant to our customer every day in this ever-changing world. So we cannot use the same playbook all the time, but forever evolving our playbook. That's what we're focusing on. Thank you.
Great. So, when I invited Belinda to be part of the panel, she asked me, like, well, you are talking about the multimodal world, why am I relevant? And I was like, well, you are running an American company in China doing so well, and this is a miracle. And I really want you to speak about, how, the Chinese market has been changing, how do you deal with potential geopolitical tension? First, very important point that I got so far is, control what you can and forget about the rest that you cannot control, right? This is very important. I'm going to come back to you because I want to talk to Fred. Fred, I remember about a year ago when I asked you the question about the future of the Chinese economy, and you made a very provocative statement, right? I was so shocked that you said that at the very beginning. China needs to stop zero COVID policies. And after you said this, it seems that the Chinese government listened to you because less than 3 weeks, they really stopped it at the very beginning of December. And I remember at the end of last year, I saw you say, well, I regretted so much that I said that because now you have to go to like 5 or 6 dinners a night. But tell me about what's going on in China since you made that statement, since you talked to us on the stage last year. It seems that we were hoping after the removal of the zero COVID strategy, there will be a big recovery. There was a rebound, but now the Chinese economy seems to be still pretty weak. In your opinion, what are the fundamental reasons and what needs to be done in order to kickstart a stronger recovery process?
Thank you. Glad to be here again. Congratulations to you and your team for staging this wonderful conference. Zero COVID, right? Chinese economy in 2022 was crippled by prolonged zero COVID. So, and it was very clear, just the bottom up, talking to businesses, consumers, there was no hope for Chinese economy to recover without removing zero COVID. That policy may have worked very well, protecting the health of Chinese people in the first phase of pandemic, but really has used up its usefulness, in the second phase of the pandemic. It did more harm than good. So, and it was clearly unsustainable. So that was why even though the consensus, even the government continued to issue headline editorial, we must adhere to zero COVID. We must persist with zero COVID. I said, no way, you couldn't do it. You have to end it. So that's what happened. With lifting zero COVID, the Chinese economy did do better. I think Chinese economy today, despite some of the lingering concerns that you just shared, definitely outperformed last year, as Belinda would tell, right? So now people can go to Starbucks, go to KFC, you can go shopping, you can dining out, and mobility, right? Intercity mobility, by the traffic metric, now exceeded the peak in 2019 pre-pandemic. So that all paved the way for gradual economic recovery is taking place right now. Well, why there's still concerns, doubts about the strength and the speed of the recovery? That's because there are some other structural or transitory challenges facing the economy. One, everyone knows in this room, housing crisis, right? So even that, I would argue the pandemic zero COVID made the housing crisis worse than it should be. But housing crisis with the price coming down, sales coming down, debt defaults, that will be a multi-year resolution process. So definitely has dampened the sentiments and definitely has dragged down economic activity. And also the wealth effect, right? So the average Chinese middle-class households, housing is a big part of their net worth. So with that come down, definitely sentiments are bad. Second, again related to zero COVID, Chinese local governments, for those of us who know China, the Chinese local governments are always doer. They make things happen, right? Whether it's incubating new projects, innovation. But at this point in time, majority of Chinese municipal county governments are literally bankrupt because 3-year-long zero COVID, all the expenses, testing, quarantine, facilities, basically exhaust the local public finance, which are, of course, also exacerbated by, the more sluggish housing market. That would take time to resolve. So we talk about more stimulus, but the local governments are incapable of doing that. Third, I think more important, is people still not quite able to shake off from the anxiety and the fear of regulatory uncertainty. The relentless climb down on the private sector in general, including housing sector, tech in particular, ed tech. Those climb downs not only wiped out trillions of dollars wealth, but also killed many jobs. Ed tech, for example, before the crackdown, China was the undisputed global leader in online learning and edtech. So many of those high-flying companies were destroyed. And millions of jobs, many of our university graduates were also lost. So people still now, after being beaten down for 3 years, people say now government is reassuring, encouraging private sector. to the minute, people still having doubts on their mind. So that will take time to resolve. So all in all, I'm glad Chinese government did lift zero COVID. And I do think the Chinese economy is recovering. As Melinda pointed out, this is the biggest middle class, and there's a lot of entrepreneurship. As confidence comes back, I'm quite optimistic over the medium long term. Chinese economy will do well and will become, indispensable engine for global economy.
So Frank, if you don't mind, let me ask a quick follow-up question, right? So we are optimistic about the medium-run situation in China, but in the very short run, let's talk about the next 6 months. Should we still expect that there will be some sort of big fiscal stimulus coming from the central government? Because you did mention the local governments, they are heavily indebted, very difficult for them to do anything. But the central government, when I look at the debt data, it's like 20% of GDP, central government debt. You may have a more accurate number. But in your opinion, why did they not do more to stimulate the economy?
Great question, Why? So that's one of my cautious optimism about China, because there's huge scope for policy actions, for a lot more policy actions. I think Mike mentioned earlier, China is an anomaly. The central bank PBOC, actually is run by my friend Pan Gongsen. The benchmark, the policy rate is still very high, right? They have a lot of room to cut all the way to zero, like all the central banks have done historically over recent years. And the fiscal, even local government, finance is in a mess. But the combined government sector, particularly central government, still in a very strong fiscal position. Even the growth rate combined together, for national government is like 30–40% of GDP, one of the lowest of all the major economies in the world. And besides, the Chinese government, unlike any other government, control a lot of assets. Land is 100% state-owned. SOE, the bank I'm sitting on the board, ICBC, 70% owned by the government, right? They have a lot of assets, telecoms, oil, gas, and you name it. So yes, if they want to, they can do another multi-trillion US dollar stimulus. But I would argue those are maybe necessary, but not sufficient. It's a confidence game. Chinese housing sector still balance sheet is very strong, unlike US households before the subprime crisis. Okay, negative saving. Right now, what we have seen through pandemic, and now Chinese saving rate continues to climb, just because of very, very cautious. They're building precautionary savings. Okay, so if I were the government, I think the cheapest stimulus, which doesn't cost any money, and the most potent, the most powerful, often the most upside, is reform. Really, regulatory reform, deregulation, loosen all the restrictions, limitations, hamstrung Chinese businesses, and with that rule of law, more transparency, really respect for private property rights, protection of entrepreneurs, so they have no fear. Right now, every entrepreneur treated very, very carefully because they worry about safety, not the safety of the property, but the safety of personal. They could disappear, at any moment. So that fear needs to be removed. I don't think that's the intention of Chinese government. Chinese government want to support private sector, but they should do far better, remove that layer of uncertainty, so that animal spirits, which are still abundant in China, but need to be revived.
Animal spirits, and we need reforms in China. Okay, so this panel is not only about China, and we have to shift gear a little bit, and back to Mike, who can really talk about anywhere in the world. You live in Europe and the US, and I want to ask you this question, which you may not have time earlier to discuss. In your book, you had one sort of suggestion how to build better economies, how to return to normalcy in the global economy, and that is, stop marginalizing multilateral organizations. And I want to ask you the following question, right? So, when we talk about the most important multilateral organizations during the hyper-globalization period, we tend to think about those Bretton Woods institutions, right? World Bank, IMF, and so on. But very recently, we started seeing new multilateral organizations, right? Down there, we had Mr. Kishore from the New Development Bank. So, all these new development banks, not created or supported by the US or the traditional West, they should be providing, new funding and new initiatives to fill in the gap when perhaps, as Victor was saying, the traditional multilateral organizations were not functioning as well as before. But could you tell us a little bit, right, when you say stop marginalizing multilateral organizations, what you have in mind? Because we also started seeing new organizations coming up. And, as we're all economists, well, most of us are economists here, competition is good, right? Tell us a little bit about, what you think about that space.
Okay, very good question. We were not, so I think, given what Victor said before, we're not suggesting at all that we can return to where we came from. It is no way to do this. There's going to be national security restrictions. We're going to have these tensions. I think the development of top flight, well-governed, additional, development banks is an entirely good thing, frankly. There's nothing wrong with competition. A single entity like the World Bank can't do the whole job. And so I've had no problem with that. And I don't even have a problem with the, the regional trade agreements. You always have to ask, as compared with what, right? And if it's as compared with nothing, then these things are moves it forward. The reason that and I think Gordon Brown was the one among our co-authors who felt the most strongly about this, is you do need entities that cover the whole global economy that are part of the governance structure. You just can't wave your hands at it. And so these organizations need first reform to reflect the underlying economic reality. You can't have Belgium outvoting China in the World Bank. It's just not going to work. Now, I don't know. I'm not necessarily optimistic about this happening in the short run, but it seems to me, one, there's a huge loss if they're not also part of the mix, and two, they can't function, indefinitely with America picking the head of the World Bank and, Europe picking the head of the by the way, in all the discussion we've had in the last 2 days, including the chief executive's policy unit, the word Europe didn't come up a single time, not once. I think this is a little bit of a mistake, but anyway.
I just mentioned Europe.
No, I know you do. I know.
You can talk about Europe now.
I know. You're the first one. So the bottom line is you need to reform these institutions so that they have legitimacy and support from a wide range of countries, and then they have a role to play. And I mean, step two would be, depends on the institution. The World Bank needs more capitalization if they're going to play a major role in the energy transition, which I think is where Ajay Banga's trying to go. In the World Trade Organization, we just have to restore its authority. I mean, the problem right now is that the major players in the global economy, accept the authority, except when it's inconvenient, and then they ignore it. And that's something China and the United States have both done. And, I don't see how we can run a global economy on an understandable set of rules if you get to decide which ones and on what occasions you obey them. So our view is the more the merrier, but let's not the problem is with nationalism and bilateral strategic competition, there is a tendency to marginalize these institutions, right? And we need them, bottom line.
Right. So you said these organizations need to be reformed. And one particular suggestion that you just made is to let, for example, China and some new emerging markets to have more voting rights, more voting power. How optimistic you are about this change? Right? I mean, these organizations essentially were created after the Second World War, essentially led by the United States, right? I mean, they have their own political considerations today, and how likely that you think it will happen?
I don't think it's very likely in the short run. So this is a cloud on the horizon for sure.
So would you therefore suggest that, you know, other new multilateral organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, or the Islamic Bank, do you think those are going to expand and potentially play a bigger role in future development funding, etc.?
I do. Maybe I could just add on. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The Next Convergence. The idea was that the emerging economies were catching up. I think there's now, in the world that we've been all talking about together, a serious risk that the low-income countries are going to, essentially fail on the convergence process because the external challenges to go along with the normal development challenges are so large. If these new entities expand, and if part of their mandate is looking after this group of, what I call at-risk countries, then I think, they'll have done a wonderful, wonderful thing. I'm just not sure their footprint is going to be broad enough to kind of cover this really important investment challenge.
Great, thank you, Mike. So let's come down to the ground level again. I want to talk about business again. It's not an easy job to moderate this panel because we have very distinguished experts from very different fields. Back to you, Belinda. So all the other three panelists have discussed mostly geopolitical challenges and risks. For you, are those factors relevant for your business in China? And what kind of business or technological innovation that Starbucks has implemented in order to turn essentially some sort of risks into opportunities?
Well, first of all, definitely impacted us with the geopolitical tension. We are a very iconic American brand operating in China. So you can imagine a lot of social media headlines on just the dinner last night or 2 days ago with the two country heads in San Francisco. I mean, there are lots, right? We are an iconic US brand. But again, like I said before, we're going to do what we can control. And we're going to keep on making sure, because when you have relationship with your customers, when you have friendship, it's less likely to be, it's more communications and more relationship you have, you become friends. And then it's the origin and the geopolitical tension, it's easier to just bypass. So that's what we're here to do, and that's the coffee house business that we operate. So in any case, 3-4 years ago, we transformed completely our business. Like I said, we opened 65% more stores. Also, we completely built out a full omni-channel business. What I mean by that is we have in-store business, we have delivery business, we have merchandising and gifting, we have e-commerce, we have RTD and channels, and also we even have a license model called We Proudly Serve Coffee, so we can show up in universities, hospitals, and operated by Nestle. So it was all built in the last 3 to 4 years with in mind where we want to go in the future. And with availability of experiences on fast coffee and convenience coffee. So from before, the majority of our business coming from walking into our store, order at a POS, like 90%, that was just 2018 or 19. Now, 48% of our business comes from the mobile device. So either from delivery, that's just a matter of 3-4 years. That's what we call China speed. So if you ever do business in China, I'm sure most of you do, the China speed is something really fun on the ground, and you got to experience. And the thing that is constant is that you have to transform. Your transformation of the business happens every day. So you got to really make sure you're relevant. So with that full spectrum of the business that is very unique to Starbucks, we feel we're very well positioned to continuing on and capture the market share. And the market has become highly competitive now, Fred will know, and with the coffee business. So we just have to be very distinctive. We have to build relationship, and we've got to make sure our people are happy. We have 63,000 employees, which we call partners. They are the ones delivering the Starbucks experience. If they're not happy, the brand experience is going to be no good. You will never come back. So, so we've got to be very careful, invest, and to make sure these ambassadors of ours will be able to craft the best coffee and delivering the best experience, friendly, kindness, right, in this world. And our third place would have to be highly relevant. If people are looking for a job, how come we should be using our stores to make sure there can be networking availability, job-seeking opportunities. I mean, that's what Starbucks is here for, to serve the community. When we're doing good, we should also be doing well. So I think that is how we want to show up, and we want to contribute positive impact into society, as well as making profits at the same time. So we're going to continue to invest.
Great. Thank you, Belinda. I think you mentioned something very important, and that is building relationships. Yesterday after dinner, Mike and I think Andrew was there to chat about the importance of having face-to-face meetings. And like many of you, I'm very glad to see President Xi went to San Francisco and talked to President Biden. I have very little idea about what they said in the closed-door meetings, but this is a good sign. The whole world is a lot more excited about the U.S.-China relations again. So, when we think about geopolitics, maybe we should start from the most bottom level, right? Think about people-to-people exchanges, think about building relationships with the customers, with the local partners, etc. So on this, let's zoom out a little bit and think about neighbors or regional relationships. And this question is for Paul. Paul, I remember almost like 20 years ago, I took your trade class, international trade class. And all these models, Ricardian, Heckscher-Ohley models, talking about why multilateral systems, multilateral liberalization is the first best when most of the economies are going to benefit the most, when emerging markets are going to catch up, and it happened a lot in the 80s and 90s. But now we live in a very different world, a fractured world, a fragmented world, and we started seeing a lot of regional trade agreements. So, theory aside, would you agree that maybe this is the restarting point, right? Having more regional trade agreements like RCEP, CPTPP, whatever, USMCA. So, our friends in our profession started doing research saying, well, regional trade agreements do expand and become more attractive, and it will get some of the foreign direct investment from outside. And perhaps if we are patient enough, wait for 10 or 20 years, some of these regional trade agreements are going to merge into mega trade agreements, and then we are back to business again, and then we can start talking about WTO again. What do you think?
So first off, I think what I thought 20 years ago was a little bit more nuanced, in the sense that the interplay between regional trade agreements and multilateral agreements is more complex. You may recall there's, a big first wave of regional trade agreements already happened in the 80s and 90s. And there was a big debate about, is this something we should be embracing or not? Folks like Jagdish Bhagwati were very worried that this was going to complicate matters and was going to lead to the stalling of the multilateral agenda. And, there's evidence that might be used to say he might have been right, in the sense that, as Victor was saying, things have not been moving. At the same time, it is also the fact that these regional trade agreements that were happening, I think some countries were left outside and maybe pushed them to be more willing to join the WTO when they might have not done that otherwise. So there's this also complementarities between that. So that's as a matter of background. In terms of the future, I don't think we're going back. I mean, I think what Victor said is right, that things were dictated by economics, and I just given you the economics of the interplay between these things, but politics are very important now. And I do think that whether certain deals are signed or not, there's factors that we used to care a lot about that are more related to the investment or labor relations and things like that. There are, issues of national security, alignment, political alignment. That's going to be much more important, and I'm worried about that. There's also the issue that Mike touched upon, which is the marginalization of international organizations, the WTO in particular. You may recall there was, I don't know how many students we had in that class, maybe 4 or 5, but one of your classmates, Ralph Ossa, is now the chief economist at the WTO. And he wrote to me a couple of years ago when he was offered the job and said, Paul, what should I do? And I was like, well, you should give it a shot, but good luck. But so it's a tricky situation with the WTO now. And I'm a little bit worried about what's going to be dictating this future agreements.
Next time when he write you an email again, ask him to work with Asia Global Institute. Right, okay. We're here to support potential reforms at the WTO. Okay, so I am aware of the time. I really want to open up to Q&A at some point. But let me ask the very last question to both Fred and Belinda. Each of you take a minute or so to tell us a little bit about how investors or businesses should respond to all these challenges, but at the same time, many opportunities are rising from digitalization or maybe even regionalization of economies. Maybe we'll start with Fred.
Yeah, so first of all, as economist, I believe in integrated global economy. That's the most efficient, optimal. But, I do worry about the politics, national security, Trump, economic logic, right? So politicians tend to do stupid things, right? Actually harm their own economies and, jobs and all that. But however, that I think, I'm not pessimistic. I do share Paul's, optimism. The maybe golden era of globalization, maybe slightly behind us or looks behind us, but the fruits are still there. Globalization is taking maybe different forms. Belinda just give us the shining story, success story of Starbucks, in China. So I'm chairman of Yum China, which is another iconic American brands. Every Chinese street you can see the smiling face of Colonel Sanders. He from Kentucky, okay, but in every Chinese city, right? So that's also actually we have more KFC stores in China than in the US, okay. So it's not the shining success of the globalization, but today companies like Starbucks and KFC, Yum in China, they are the global leaders in digitization, in innovation, and being regional, actually, right now, actually, also give them advantage. Belinda can have empowered, more operational autonomy, closer to the customers, and in a position to respond to the local conditions, and the needs, demands, and innovate, right? So I think definitely Yum China is also a great example. So, we share a lot of heritage with the Yum brands in the US, but we have a lot of autonomy. We can do things that fits China, and we are able to innovate at much faster speed, what Belinda called the China speed. Okay, so and we also share our best practice, with our counterparts in America and across the world, right? So that is the benefits of globalization. Not only share the brands, but also the share our technology and the business practice. In terms of digitization, again, I think in terms of traditional consumer service economy, China has leapfrogged, become a global leader, almost even undisputed global leader. So then, because of the connectivity we still have in place, so we can share this kind of technology, diffuse that technology to the rest of the world, right? So that's also a benefit of globalization. So at the end of the day, common sense, rationality, and mutual benefits hopefully will make the politicians a bit more, more sensible.
Great. Belinda?
Thank you. I guess I just want to make 2 points. One is more on the business side on the question that you've asked. I think since 12 years ago, we've started to build an infrastructure that we know we need to be self-sufficient. So a couple months ago, all the way to a couple months ago, we have opened our Coffee Innovation Park, which consisted a roasting plant, a distribution center, and an immersive experience center. And that completes our fully integrated, vertically integrated supply chain system for us. So that is going to make us more ready for any risk or more ready for our more rapid expansion in the future. So that is the last step that we've made. And also the technology center is going to help us in China creating new experiences and innovations for China. So we don't have, in the last decade or so, when we accelerate our business, we are not going back to the US and say, what can you do to help me and can you do this for me? It's all here in China, looking at the Chinese consumers' demands, wants, needs, and tailor the experiences for them. So we're going to continue to do that. To do that, it requires not just talk, but investment, commitment, and all of that. So that has been our formula in the last 12 years. And again, we're well positioned. The other point I want to make is about this geopolitical tension, right? I am very well aware of it does require several business leaders and businesses or iconic brands to tell the story of China. Every earnings call, every investor day that we have, people look at the China business of Starbucks or other business. Frankly speaking, Yum China, with what Joey and we share our business and how we're doing in China, it does a lot of businesses in China gives the Wall Street or the Western media indication of how well China is doing or not. So a bunch of us are very well aware of that. We have to be great storytellers, authentic with integrity, but we have to really speak up on the truth on what's going on in China business. So that's what we have been very intentionally doing with Starbucks. Because there are a lot of things, there are a lot of myths out there from Western media on the business environment in China that is not true, honestly. And I think one of the mission that I feel we have at Starbucks with our business so visible in China, we have a real mission to stand up and really tell the truth about operating in China. And the last point I want to make is the 25 years in China, the early success, we're only in chapter 2 in the 20 chapter book. We could not have done it without the help and support from the Chinese government. And I'm not talking about lip service. They are looking for innovations. We share the same mutual respect and common shared values on common prosperity. We want to create jobs. We want to treat our people very well. And they support us all the time. On the latest example of our opening on roasting plant, our technology center, we could not have done this without them. And also the opening of our roastery in 2017, where it's just right above the metro station when we have a real roasting facility up there. They, because of their desire to have innovative retail experience, they work with us. They created a national committee to help us to be able to open that store. And there are probably 100 people in our team, government affairs, building relationships, spending the time authentically with the different government bodies in districts, cities, and stuff. So this is an investment that has to be authentic. You have to invest time. You have to understand what they're thinking, and they have to understand our story, what we're thinking, and come together in middle ground. It's not like they have to listen to us or we have to listen to them. So I wanted to make sure you understand Starbucks' success, early success, could not have been possible without their support, the government support, but continuously we will have to move on together, onward, to see what we can continue to build together. But we're going to continue to share our stories publicly to the West here and in the East as well, to make sure more communications, more dialogues can happen. Thank you.
I agree with you absolutely. You know, working with Dr. Victor Feng for a few years, I started to realize the importance of business-to-business relationship, think tank to think tank relationships, because, you know, with all this tension between big countries' governments, you know, our roles are actually bigger to contribute to better economies. Not only that, but also to contribute to better geopolitical relationship. So I'm looking at this clock, which is very disturbing. There are only 12 minutes left, but I was told that as a director of AGI, I have some authority to ignore the clock and just open up the floor for Q&A for 20 minutes. How about that, right? You know, we have half an hour coffee break, but let's cut the coffee break and have like 20 minutes conversation between the audience and the 4 distinguished panelists. Any question? Oh, let me set up the rule first. You know, tell me about your name, your background, and ask a question, not multiple questions, and be short and crisp. Brian, I know you will always be the first one to ask questions. So, Brian Wong.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Brian. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here in HKU. And my question concerns essentially regionalization, because you guys talked extensively about multilateralism and also what that means for globalization at large. But I was just wondering if there might be different types of multilateral institutions. So some are more oriented around particular regions, looking at, say, ASEAN-specific institutions, or in Mercosur, or in the GCC, and then others straddle a multitude of regions. So looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, alternatively, the proposed corridor between India and the EU. And then finally, there's international multilaterals, so the likes of, say, the World Bank, IMF, and so forth. How do these different categories of multilateral institutions interact and also engage with one another? And what are the implications of their relative salience on the state of globalization as is? Are we worried, or should we be worried about regionalization? Thank you very much.
So this is a question for Belinda?
I think for the panel.
Mike or Paul, any thoughts?
My reaction to that is, you know, even in the golden age that Victor and Fred talked about, we've had regional, you know, development banks, Asia Development Bank, the African Development Bank, you know, and so on. So now we've got a richer set, you know, with the new development bank and so on. But I don't think there's any, you know, that I can see any kind of problem with them. And frankly, they can work together. So I don't think that's where the issues really lie. I mean, it's a good question, but I you know. So yes, we're getting some regional development banks in addition, big region ones that are attempts to open up global trade in a way that might have been done in a fully multilateral system. And, you know, as Paul said, some people thought, well, that's kind of a problem, but that was when we thought we could hold on to the full-blown multilateral system, and now we know we essentially can't. Is that helpful? Yeah. Okay.
Paul, you have anything to add?
No. I mean, not really. I mean, I think these things can work in tandem, and I think you know, it's well understood that at the regional level, there's a lot of things that can happen, and I think that the key issue is exactly if we're moving from a unimodal to a multimodal system, how are these regions going to be interacting with each other? That's the key question, I think, at least in my mind.
Great. Next question, Victor.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that theme and just dig down a little deeper. You know, during the height of the multilateral era, I think we had what was really a proliferation of bilateral deals, FTAs. And we got what we call the spaghetti bowl effect, right? Which really was not helpful to the development of the multilateral system. Now, given all the geopolitical issues now in the world, I think it is very difficult to use the WTO as an example, have one protocol driven from Geneva, having, sort of doing a system that will govern 167 countries or wherever it's up to now, and in a system in which every country basically has a veto. So it's just not practical. So I'd like to ask the panel, is there something in between? Don't go all the way to bilaterals and small FTAs and the spaghetti bowl effect. Definitely keep the multilateral in mind for the long term. But in the interim stage, can we actually go to the idea of mega regions? And then, I can think of three at least. Obviously, Asia Pacific, the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and of course, North and South America. And within those mega regions, there could be a lot of trade. We have set the example, as Henry was saying, in Asia with the RCEP, which is an open regionalism concept with very low barriers for adding more people, and it's very inclusive. I'm just wondering whether, given the headwinds that we have today, whether we can actually now do a little bit of an end run and go to the mega region, what I call the mega region level, and then come back together to form the multilateral system.
Thank you, Victor. Maybe Paul can have a start first.
Yes, so I mean,
spaghetti.
in theory, that sounds like a good idea. In practice, one might worry that by following that approach, you're going to end up with a bimodal world, which I think many of us believe that might end up being the worst case scenario. The other thing I'd point out is, and something that I've sort of become increasingly aware of, is that it's not entirely clear what these mega regions would look like. So where I live in the US, I think there's a perception that this idea of friendshoring, of trading with our allies is going to work because the US has a very close relationship with lots of countries. But then I go around, I'll give you an example. I was in Chile in March. I think we Americans think about Chile as a strong ally. And I was at a conference at the central bank. And they were saying very openly, copper is essential for us. I was checking this morning, more than 50% of Chilean exports are copper. Right. Lots of it is going to the US, but most of it is going to China. China is by far Chile's largest trading partner. They export more than twice as much to China than to the US. And they were saying very openly, if we're asked to choose, are we on this mega regional deal or that one? It's really not obvious which way we're going to go. So there's a bit of an uncertainty of what that might look like. Living in the US, I'm getting increasingly worried that that would be, the US would end up in the smaller of those blocks. But regardless of the relative size, it's just, I don't think that would be conducive to reducing tension. So I'm personally much more eager to kind of try to resuscitate a multilateral type of approach.
Great. So you're not giving up yet. Mike, anything to add? Or?
No, I mean, I first of all, Paul's thought about it, and Victor more carefully than I have. What I don't understand yet is what happens when businesses, driven by their own incentives, responding to risk, diversify, and how that meets the trade agenda, the kind of international negotiation side of it. That's too complicated for me at this moment anyway to figure out. But they're both going on at the same time.
Well, one quick reaction I'd say is diversification sounds like a great idea, but it's extremely costly.
Oh, no,
So-
listen, I live in Europe, okay? We are diversifying away from dependence on Russian fossil fuels at a very high speed. It's incredibly expensive. I mean, we would have killed the economy last year, except we got lucky and had a warm winter. I mean, so I just want to, I mean, second, what I was trying to say is this world is going to have a very different set of supply conditions because of this diversification, and it's going to be a whole lot more expensive than the old one. So I'm with you completely on that.
Great. Next question. Wow, a lot. Louis, and then Mark. Louis first. I will get to you, Sabrina. Sorry, I'm a bit biased because my chair is tilted to the other side. Louis first.
Hi, I'm Louis. Thank you. I'm this year's fellow from Hong Kong, China. So I'm on a more practical level. I met Mr. Hu and Harvard China Forum a few years. And I just want to take the example about Starbucks because I get all this trend. I was in Beijing for 10 years. So state-owned enterprise is getting more influences for taking gigantic business like McDonald's completely acquired by CITIC. So I can see the trends of company is getting more the invest from the state-owned enterprise. So I want to see from the future, the next 5 years, what will this kind of trend affecting us as an investors or business leader? So let me rephrase a little bit because there used to be a lot of MNC in China, basically report directly to the state, to European headquarters. But right now, there's a trend that they will become more state-owned enterprise and state-hold from the province level government and the country level government, similar to Singapore. Thank you.
I think this is for you, Fred, or maybe Belinda can also add up.
I think it's too overgeneralizing when you talk about a trend. There are reasons why McDonald's and CITIC were, the deal happened, right? So So I want to make sure it doesn't sound like the state-owned companies are taking over or anything. I mean, it's just at the end of the day, it's investment opportunities, right? And yeah, I mean, it's open secret. I mean, a lot of MNCs are thinking about how the de-risking factors if they're worrying about geopolitical tensions, what's going to happen in the future, how you're going to structure your company. I mean, these are very common topics. Among the boards, among the local leadership and global leadership. So as for Starbucks, I don't know how passionate I could be more to tell you how committed we are in China. And I think action speaks louder with the investment dollars that we're putting in. And we did think about how we're going to structure ourselves in the future. And so far, we feel company operated. We are 100% company owned, which is very different from the current trend right now. A lot of, frankly speaking, we just had an investor forum in New York last week, and I was being asked, like, are you going to change to a franchise model or license or whatever? And we told them 3 times, say, we love our company operated structure, and we're going to continue to go, and we feel that's the best way to grow our business right now in the right way of brand investment, digital investment, and our people investment. So we're gonna continue to do that. That's a big decision for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Fred, you have anything to add? Okay, Mark, and then Sabrina, and then there's a question at the back. Mark first.
Thank you for a thought-provoking panel. I'm Mark Wu from Harvard University. I'm curious from the panel's perspective, how much of the medium-term optimism in productivity growth is contingent as opposed to not at all dependent upon open data flows, particularly for generative AI and for life sciences and so forth. I would posit that at least in the medium term, the national security and political interests will see a rising level of restrictions on data, and that is, of course, very different than the last wave of globalization that we saw. So I'm wondering how much that poses a risk to the medium-term optimism as opposed to it's not relevant to the story here.
This is a question for Mike. You have done some work on AI.
Well, yeah, I think several people can comment on it. I mean, It's complicated, okay. So the most obvious thing that's going on right now is the restrictions on semiconductors, which are increasingly tailor-made for artificial intelligence. I believe the effect of that will be to hold China, slow it down a little bit, but not permanently. And second, there's a complete bifurcation in the AI world, in the AI research world. As little as 5 years ago, all these people talked to each other. If you lined them up, you couldn't tell whether they lived in the United States or China, right? That's all gone. If I asked one of the leading AI people in the world on the West Coast, if they were interested in coming to a conference in China this spring. And this person looked at me and said, "Are you crazy?" Okay? So that's the extreme version of that. The other thing is the flow of data issues are really important in Victor's world because you need that data to flow to coordinate the supply chains. You don't need, you can train the AIs, they're trained on the internet data. Right now, the verticals that are built, you know, the use cases that are built on top of the Gen AI platforms, which we will see coming out of this period of intense exploration and experimentation now. There you might have some sort of data issues, I think. So bottom line is, I think we can get a fair amount of the benefits of this without completely solving the data portability issue, but where I think it really bites is in operating platforms or multinational enterprises where you really just have to have agreement. I mean, Victor can talk about this. You have to have these agreements in the Greater Bay Area, you know, or it won't even work here. I mean, that's kind of where I am on that. Yeah, Fred, have you thought this through?
Yeah, just a quick. I do think the restrictions on cross-border data flow would undercut the potential, the benefits of generative AI on productivity and efficiency. But having said that, you know, the adoption at scale of whatever generative AI tools, you know, APIs across each different industry still generate enough, you know, sufficient compelling gains. So still worth, you know, investing by companies and, you know, industries to do that, you know, given the limitation we have, you know, globally. So that's still a wonderful technology to embrace.
Anyone else? Okay, so we can take two more questions. Sabrina first, and then there's a gentleman in the back.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sabrina Fong from Fong Retailing. First of all, I wanted to thank you know, Belinda and Fred for sharing your stories about how you speak the China story so eloquently on sort of the world stage. That's number one. I think that's very important, you know, as sort of what Professor Spence also just spoke about. But also on the topic of generative AI, and then, you know, ChatGPT going forward. You know, Belinda, you also mentioned about how Starbucks has recently built a technology park in the Greater Bay Area. How do you see sort of Starbucks using this park to engage the 65,000, you know, employees that you currently employ? And then, you know, you're in 600 plus cities. How do you feel that could help China or the consumers in China morph or engage itself to turn into the next stage of the consumer experience, and whether there's any reverse engineering that you're doing back in the US market? And for Fred as well, thanks.
So one fundamental principle that you need to understand is that we actually want our people only focusing on three things at the store. One is craft of coffee. So we want them to handcraft their coffee, for sure. We're not gonna replace it by any automated machine. So we want their time to be spent on craft. And also two things. One is taking care and developing their the team members at the store. So developing people, that cannot be replaced. And also connection with customers. That has to be human connection as well. So other than that, our team and I are on a quest of what then, if those are the three things we want them to spend their time on, what can we do to automate everything else, right? To make our business more productive. And we believe that it will bring productivity and efficiency quickly for our business because we are at our scale. So in the last few years, we all not only transform our experience and at the customer front, we also transform our supply chain and store operations. So now we're using digital technology and also AI to look at our labor scheduling. So you forecast our sales and then help our store manager to give them the first draft, I guess, the labor scheduling and how we, and take into account the trend of weather, you know, how you run retail, right? So to give them, and that gives us, that gave us great productivity. So you take a lot of time away from that. And also you're actually using real data to project. So that we have launched and that's doing for us very well. And the other big part is inventory, right? Management at the store level. So there's whole upstream, as you all know, you're the experts in this field. If I do it well in my store, then the upstream part on forecasting and ordering, it will improve tremendously. And also food safety, I mean the aftermath of that, right? Food safety, the number of hours you spend in store, we have digitalized that whole piece. That gave us great savings. From all angles, not just the inventory value, logistics costs, and everything, right? Labor hours. So that has worked very well for us. And I want to give another example that nobody actually think about. We have 63,000 people. How do you actually communicate with them? How do you really increase their engagement? So we have developed a partner app, which we, and one more thing that you need to know, we're now hiring our newest baristas full-time. They're like born in 2002 or 3. So we have got to learn how to interact and engage with them. You can't just use what you used to do and then they can't connect with you because you're too old-fashioned. So we have built a partner app and brought everything into the app and make sure we're training them in the way that they're used to as a digital native. You know, how they look at, you know, Douyin and everything. We're doing our training programs in the same way. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure they apply the standards in our store. So how do you engage 63,000 people at scale, making sure there's training, their engagement, you can have posting, you're sharing your story, you're making them feel like they're part of community. And also all the standards and KPIs are all in one place. Onboarding experience, exiting experience, and everything. So that partner app has helped us tremendously using technology and AI in each different module to help us to run our business at a pretty efficient level. I'm very proud to tell you, we did a partner survey and just a couple of months ago, the score for retail with like 90% participation rate on 63,000 people, we score an engagement score of 88. I mean, I think that's like off the roof. I mean, but we're staying humble and making sure we're going to continue to engage these people. 9 out of 10 people would recommend Starbucks, would recommend a friend to come and work for Starbucks. I mean, that's pretty high in industry standard in terms of engagement. So technology, AI, we're barely at the beginning. That's why we are so keen on this technology center in this Greater Bay Area, so we can do more, because this is a never-ending thing. Technology, there will be new technology next year and the year after, and then we're going to have to continue to evolve. Thank you, Sabrina.
Amazing, Belinda. Fred, you have anything to add? Or? All right, so last question.
Thank you. I am Liu Kinming, a former journalist and a public affairs consultant. A quick question for Ms. Wong. Any plan of trying to move back to the Forbidden City? Thank you.
Curveball question.
Wow. We will open in anywhere that would welcome Starbucks. I don't want to go back to history, and there was a lot of other reasons for that whole media like a story for the Forbidden City, but we are in many tourist spots. If you go to Xi'an, to the Terracotta Museum, we're there. We are in Badaling. We are very proud to serve Starbucks coffee in places where we are allowed to do commercial. And by the way, when we were opening at Forbidden City, we were allowed to do commercial there as well many years ago. But that has a lot of other stories we can talk about over a cup of coffee. But but we're in many tourist spots and Gaotie and airport and proudly serving the Chinese customers everywhere. Thank you.
Awesome. I think we can continue the conversation forever, but in the interest of time, I have to summarize this panel. First thing I want to say is, I guess, you have attended a lot of conferences in the last few weeks. This is by far the most open, the most dynamic conference that I have been to. A lot of the conferences that you attended didn't even have Q&A, and those questions that we got just now were amazing, and the responses were equally, if not more amazing. So thank you so much for all the panelists to shed light about the multimodal world. I hope you feel a bit more optimistic than 15 minutes ago, because we have heard from Victor, who I believe is the most optimistic person I met in Hong Kong, becoming less optimistic. We have heard Mike giving unfortunately only 20 minutes keynote speech. Didn't also seem to shed a lot of positive light on the earth. But after this panel, I've become more energetic. I've become more optimistic. And I guess, I drink more than 380 Starbucks coffee per year. And that's why, I have this very high level of energy. Okay, I should stop here. And thank you so much for the panel.
Thank you so much.